Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons, Sarah Turner, Alexander Lashley and Avery. For as little as $3, you can gain access to Patreon-only episodes, as well as access to our Discord server, where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. This week, substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero and myself talk with two anthropologists, William Dawley and Fartein Nilsen, both of which are part of a larger team working on a fascinating project called Technoscientific Immortality, a study of human futures.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
This project focuses on different ways that people, through technology and science, are trying to live forever. I guess that's the most value-neutral way I can sort of put it. And in this techno-scientific spectrum of ways to do this, there are sort of biological ways, biomedical paths that people are pursuing, and then there are digital ways, I guess you could say, or computerized ways. And so because we have a research team, we're sort of dividing up the labor a bit, but also trying to overlap a bit, and then we're accompanying one another to different parts of our field sites. But my main focus is on what I guess in a very jargony way I'm calling bio-inclusive forms, biological ways of that people are trying to live forever. Everything from sort of just anti-aging research, and we recently went to a big research expo on that kind of thing together as a team, to cryonics, which is the practice people have of trying to preserve their bodies at liquid nitrogen temperatures for centuries if need be, to wait for in their hopes, biomedical science and perhaps digital technologies to advance far enough that they can continue their lives.
Right.
Sorry, I know that seems like incredibly value neutral.
No.
My hardest to start that way.
It's all good. Is the end game just to sort of have a broad overview of what this field sort of thinks?
The initial anthropological tendency is just to sort of map it and understand it in a very, not to use this word again, but in a very sort of value neutral way, and then perhaps to point out some prescriptive, I guess, part to some aspects of anthropology, and that I guess the hope is that you look at different ways that people have led their lives, and hopefully you learn something. So it's a bit like applied philosophy in that way, sometimes as a field. So I do think we hope to have insights that might be useful both to the people using these technologies and then people in general. But yeah, that's probably a slightly later goal, I guess. Fartein, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah. So while the project is dealing with death, right, and immortality, but we're also interested in how this is reconfiguring kinship relations or social relations. Like if you take death out of the equation, how does that reconfigure social relationships? And what kind of care goes into, like, for example, you can't just freeze yourself in liquid nitrogen alone. There needs to be a whole care apparatus around you, family and estate, everything. So it's not just an individual task. There's a whole social world around it, and that's what we're interested in getting at, as well as comparing this. So we have the U.S. cases, which William and I and our project leader Annalyn are doing, and then we have a Russian case, which Professor Anya Bernstein at Harvard University is looking into.
Okay.
So what we're doing, we're looking at this through the prism of kinship.
Right. And so it's interesting, sort of the idea of sort of observing it, learning some stuff from it. Like in terms of this idea of being sort of value neutral, is that sort of an end game of all anthropologists? I'm just thinking of like David Graeber, who definitely had, I guess, a sort of value judgment on how how things could be, whilst also being an anthropologist. So I just wondered if you guys have a sort of position or positions that have maybe even changed over time. I don't know.
No. I think eventually that does come, but there's both practical and I guess like processual reasons why it comes later, which is that initially, like if you read Graeber's earliest work, and he's describing this, he's definitely taking a position about the way that things have unfolded on Madagascar. But when you're at the early stage of research, if you step in with a bunch, I'm sure this is maybe relatable from a therapeutic practice, but you obviously have to withhold a bit of judgment of, maybe not of everything, but at least obviously of the people that you're directly interacting with. But then later, I think this is something that for me, at least, and I think in a lot of the American tradition comes a bit later. A lot of people come to have sort of an activist position on the things that they study. But in the early stages of doing field work, it can get in the way of having access to people, talking to different kinds of people, and that kind of thing.
Are the people doing this immortality mostly men? Or is there a significant number of women?
Well, yes and no. I think it's a bit complex. Well, in the cryonic scene, there seems to be mostly men.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
it's
that
about
right?
80-20. Yeah,
80-20,
members
yeah.
at Alcor, it's 80-20, essentially male-female. But in the anti-aging world, I would say it's closer to 50-50. When we went to RADFest, which is this big, I kid you not, the title of this is The Revolution Against Aging and Death Festival. So it's like a research expo of some of whose participants find other participants' findings more or less, credible, and also, so it's partly a research expo, but it's also people that are interested in fending off aging and death in this way. And the crowd was way more gender balanced. We all three noticed that immediately based on our perception, let's say, of cryonics or something, and the sort of hard numbers there.
It's interesting, actually, just sort of going back a bit to an earlier point, you're saying sort of the idea of social relationships or kinships, like what's that like once death doesn't exist or, life continues on for a lot longer. There's a sort of, I guess, very old idea, which is that it's finitude that gives life value. So in what ways... I mean, I guess, what do you think about that idea or that statement? And in what ways do you have any sort of insights yet about how you think extended life or immortality would affect relationships between people?
Well, first off, within the community of immortalists, that statement of that it's finitude that gives life value would be considered a form of what they call it deathism, right? That the worship of death, and then they, in a way, and they want to go beyond that. So they don't see it as a bad thing to have, infinite amount of something isn't necessarily bad, and so many of them see the experiencing self as the ultimate good, and the experiencing self should be extended in time. Or do you agree with that, Will?
Yeah, they'll often make there's a couple of ways when this question comes up that I would say, if I'm trying to answer for the people that I'm trying to get to know, they'll say, well, wouldn't you want to live 10 years? Just in the past 10 years or so, we extended some lifespans in some places by X amount, why not 10 more years? And they'll sort of make this, why not 10 years beyond that argument? And also, they'll point out, I think, certain things like resuscitating people through CPR and, jolts of electricity is actually a pretty recent practice. That the way death has been declared in the past has changed a lot over time. And we've talked about brain death has become a more common way of understanding the boundaries of life. Whereas in the past, it was just if the heart stopped or was perceived to have stopped, which wasn't always easy to tell in the very ancient past. So it's an interesting question. I think they would sort of raise these definitional issues about what is death. And for them, they take the perspective of what they often call informatic death, where for them, they've pushed this boundary further and said death doesn't occur until, so it's further along that brain death path. Death doesn't occur until the brain is degraded beyond the point where it can be resuscitated. And so from the cryonicist point of view, this is why like it's a race against time immediately. They have sort of an obsession with, we can't know what's going to happen in the future. All that we can do is on this end. And so the teams that I've talked to of cryonicists in Europe and in the US are sort of trying to figure out how to shorten the time between the legal declaration of death, when they can start legally working on the person because the body has been donated to science at that point legally, and then that they can get this person on the path to cooling them so they can stop a certain kind of degradation that comes to the brain through apoxia by not having enough oxygen over a period of time. So that's the sort of medical or technical goal in their mind. But in the philosophical sense, they just think that if you can preserve the brain, you can preserve the person. And they'll sort of point to the fact that, and very recently we've extended the person, by decades, and we can continue to do that. So that's the sort of EMIC perspective, as we call it, the inside perspective. People outside of it in biology and stuff will find some of these claims, more or less credible, and often less, So there's a sort of argument between what's possible and what a lot of scientists are willing to go on the record and sort of say, they think is credible.
Are you able to kind of explain the process of what happens to the body in cryolysis?
Yeah. So basically the goal is to drain the body of watery fluids and replace it slowly, in a sort of slow way, with cryopreservant, which is sort of like I'll say it this way because I've heard them say it this way, like medical grade antifreeze. So the goal is like, if you're going to freeze somebody, it's the same reason if you freeze a grape in the freezer and then unfreeze it, it's soft, right? I mean, the formation of ice crystals is the main barrier to freezing something and unfreezing it, anything living. So yeah, their goal is to replace as much of the water as possible. They used to do this in the way that you would do it in the funerary homes, because a lot of people come from that background, which is through the carotid artery. Now it's done in the more advanced cases, like a bit like open heart surgery. Although the number of people that do it that way is growing. That's the growing way of doing it. You sort of open the chest and you use the heart's use the heart's vessels directly. They used to do it through the throat. But the idea is that they do as much as possible of that, and they get cooling the body as quickly as possible, because they're starting to realize that even just bringing the body temperature down to, above freezing does a lot for decreasing like the amount of damage that's done to the body. So from their perspective, they try to rush. They put this person in essentially an ice bath. Mm-hmm. And then they are moving them. They can have dry ice, which is negative 80 Celsius, and then they eventually, when they'll get them to liquid nitrogen, it's negative 190. And that's a very slow process where they want to do it at a very slow and steady rate. And currently, that's where people are stored at the temperature of liquid nitrogen. There's some newer technology where they're trying to store them at a negative 140 Celsius. The idea being that there may be somewhat less damage, but it's more technically complicated. The current method of storing people doesn't require any electrical input, actually, which is usually a question people ask, like, what happens if the power goes out? How are you going to be preserved, essentially? But the answer is like, no, actually, you just need someone to top off the evaporating liquid nitrogen, because it stays at that temperature by itself. But the tricky part is getting people down in their mind, decreasing the damage. Although there are different schools of thought about what kind of damage you'll be able to undo in the future, given medical technologies the way that they're imagining them.
Is the idea that this technology would eventually be available for everyone to some degree, whether it's the cryo stuff or whether it's just extending life generally, or is this very much sort of the pursuit of the wealthy?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. And I'll pass this on to Fartein quickly, and I'll give you the long version. But in cryonics, the way it's done largely is through life insurance. And so there's a whole story of this that's kind of about the American medical system and the way everyone pursues their health, mental health and physical health, sort of individually, in the hands of insurers and providers and stuff. And so in a broader way, this is kind of a story that links into bigger things about medical tourism and, elective surgery. And the answer, I think, is that they will give you an argument from the inside that, like cell phones and et cetera, and they'll list versions of technologies that were initially adopted by the rich and then filtered down in their mind. But in a practical matter, the way this is done through life insurance, it was traditionally done through term life insurance. You take out like a policy for the amount that it would cost to have this done. It's currently $200,000 for a full body preservation and about $80,000 for a neuropreservation, which is just the head and a bit of the spine. And so that's been paid with through life insurance. But Fartein can tell you about technologies where the hope is that these are much, much less expensive, including one we just visited recently. Fartein, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Oh yes, all the immortalists, like even the cryonicists, will say that the end goal is that everyone is supposed to live forever, right? It's very expensive. The biological solutions are very expensive, but on the digital end of things, you get more reasonable solutions. And that's more of my focus in the project. I'm focusing on the creation of digital twins and virtual companions, and these posthumous avatars that allow people to extend their presence post-mortem. And so you have a couple of companies here in the US right now, one of which we visited yesterday, which is located in LA. It's called Storyfile, and they're focusing on these interactive videos. And it all started, they started out making these interactive videos of interviews with Holocaust survivors that they made for museums. And then they expanded from there because they, as the CEO, Heather Smith, told us, she got a lot of comments on like, how can I do this for myself? How can I do this for my grandparents? How can I do this for my parents? So they saw that there was a market there really to make these available to everyone, and they are very the tech is very available because all you need is a webcam or a phone really to capture these snippets of information from your life. You sit down at your computer and you record yourself answering questions, and then they will make this interactive video. So it's not immortality in the in the kind of proper sci-fi sense, but it is a form of symbolic immortality. It's a form of interactiveness that we haven't seen before in these relations between the living and the dead. So, but you have a couple of these companies that have been popping up, like startups that have been popping up the last couple of years. Like if you go back to 2015, I don't know if you heard about Eternyme, the company was called. It was a startup. It came out of MIT, actually.
I think so, yeah. I heard of that one, yeah.
And the slogan was like Skype with the dead, right? Skype with the dead. And so that's the exact same idea, right? You're supposed to collect all of the information. We leave a lot of information online, and we have all of this information about ourselves, the way and how we speak, how we interact with others. And the idea is that you can collect all of that and then make a simulated person, right? But so, like, you go back to 2015 and you have all of these headlines saying like, "Oh, will digital technology allow us to live forever?" And it's very sensationalist in the media. But when you talk to some of the developers, so Eternity has just disappeared. Doesn't like it kind of just, ran out of steam, it seems like, in 2017 or something like that. But then a different company came along. It's called Hereafter AI. And it's founded by this tech journalist called, his name is James Vlahos. And he also had he was in the media because he had made a chatbot of his dying father that he called Dadbot. And then they have these stories, right, that they get the idea after they've done something like this, and then people reach out to them and say that they want something like this for themselves. So, and then he founded Hereafter AI. But when I talked to James, he said that the media tends to blow all of this up. They talk about immortality in all caps, but he has no, he doesn't see it like that. He sees this as a kind of, a way of helping people cope with grief. It's not supposed to be immortality in all capital letters.
Right.
He sees it as something more low key than that.
It's kind of a interactive memorial.
Yeah, very
in
much
that
like,
way,
like
right?
That. Yeah.
Well, a lot of Facebook pages work like that already, don't they? There's a book called Ghost in the Machine, I think, or something like that talks about having to deal with this new form of digital death and who holds all that data and who actually owns it. It's kind of interesting as well when you're talking about the interactive videos. I was thinking about the hologram of Tupac and movie stars being recreated on the screen, which is really interesting as well because there's IP, intellectual property right stuff. Let's say with the movie, right, you sign your image away and then they own you sort of in some digital way, potentially for eternity. And it's also interesting that companies fold as well and they disappear. So, there's this idea of like preserving someone who's passed away. But if those videos exist as part of that company's intellectual property right, and then they go under, like it's a sort of second death you might not be have been prepared for, right?
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where reality and sort of, economics and capitalism sort of can come into interrupt stuff like that, I guess.
And people, because back in, I don't know, a couple of years ago, Facebook said that they would delete these pages, like the pages of deceased people. And there was an uproar, because of this second death, people didn't want to lose that. And that's when they implemented the memorial page function. And I think the same thing happened with, I think it was Twitter as well, because people want these pages.
Right. I mean, they do. I've had a couple of Facebook friends pass away over the last 12 years or so that I've been using Facebook. And I do find myself occasionally thinking about them and like going to their Facebook, page and going through the photographs and some of their posts, and it's kind of nice, actually.
So if I will allow myself to not be value neutral here, is that it is kind of insidious that you take this real human need, to connect with your deceased loved ones, and like you said, it becomes the property of a multinational corporation.
Yeah, that it's mediated by these companies is the weird bit. At the point that you die, maybe you should be going off onto some, I don't know, state-funded server that's the equivalent thing, or community-funded thing. I think the sort of funnier one is the LinkedIn profiles, right? Like there's one thing where, because it's sort of interesting, you were sort of talking about the sort of social relationships and how they might be affected by extended life or just no death. And it's one thing to go to a friend's Facebook page or Twitter page that's passed away, but the LinkedIn one is the one of complete that's the one that feels the weirdest, right? Because that wasn't about like just hanging out with your friends. That was about like working, surviving. And that feels, because I often get like a LinkedIn thing from a person that I know.
You said that,
yeah.
When you said it, it just made me think I would love, as an ethnographic question, I would love to find the people that are in an uproar about having their LinkedIn, like, this is me. Like, I don't want you to leave. Like, this is who this person was.
Exactly.
I want to meet those people and interview them so much.
Because it's like, in some ways, LinkedIn's already dead, like, and so you're not going there for like the warm, fuzzy feelings, are you? It's
right.
It's anyway, I guess that's a side, but it just made me chuckle thinking about it.
I mean, in grief, generally speaking, like, people's career history is usually not like your first memory that you want to like
exactly.
remind yourself about your friend that passed away.
It's like going to a gravestone. And look at their CV.
He'll be succeeded by a strong portfolio.
There's a great meme of two coffins, and they're exactly the same, and it says successful people, unsuccessful people. It works better as a picture, but I'll put it in the show notes. Just to sort of get us slightly back on track, I guess. Was there a particular reason that the focus is on the USA and Russia, opposed to other countries?
Well, maybe Fartein has other insights on this, because he started in the project a bit earlier, for a few months earlier than I did. But my understanding, from the way that I've heard Annalyn describe it, is that Anya had done this research. People had started to do the research on the project in the US, and there was the growing awareness that there was a bit of an overlap. There's a place, for instance, in Florida, and I think Vice News did like a short, like 20-minute bit on this, called the Church of Perpetual Life. It's founded by Bill Falloon, who's founded a number of companies, some of which had to do with supplements and some of which had to do with age-related research. And this church kind of has as two of its saints Arthur C. Clarke, or two of its prophets, I guess is the way to put it, and Nikolai Fedorov. And Arthur C. Clarke is like the sci-fi guy, and he says something, and they quote him as saying something that Fartein helped me here, that any science or technology that is sufficiently complicated that it can't be understood is indistinguishable from magic. I'm sort of paraphrasing badly here.
Yeah, that's it. That's the quote.
But basically, the other guy, Fedorov, is this Russian Orthodox Christian philosopher that thought, that this was basically our goal, that not only was bodily resurrection, going to happen, but it couldn't just happen. We're supposed to do it. And it's part of a broader, I guess, number of movements in Russia that sought to, share blood between generations. In this particular version, Fedorovian stuff, to resurrect the ancestors ultimately. So it's a very different kind of project, and the people involved in some of their motivations. There are groups, parts of this Russian cryonicist community, especially, that are like the Americans and sort of secularist explicitly, but there are others that are Fedorovian, that sort of take a religious view of this. And there are other organizations, like a Mormon organization, for instance, that's very big. The Mormon Transhumanist Association, that a colleague of ours, John Bielecki, has written about, that sort of have taken a religious take on this. And it is sort of unavoidable when you look at what's being promised, the bodily resurrection, at least in some of the versions I'm studying, the sort of eternal life, the paradise on earth, all this kind of stuff. I mean, it does look a lot like certain non-secular promises, in certain traditions that probably influenced, in some ways directly influenced, what people are interested in pursuing here. So I think that's interesting too. Perhaps we all come from anthropology of religion as well. So,
right. Yeah. And that's actually a sort of a follow-up question then, because like you said, it has these connections to history or, older ideas. To what degree is that stuff sort of incorporated in how you sort of compare and contrast this, this new technology, this sort of transhuman, sort of sci-fi, modern, futuristic stuff obviously it's not really new. It's like as old as kind of humans have been around. So are you drawing any sort of kind of insights in comparing what people are doing right now to what people have done in the past? And, is there really any difference?
Well, I would just say that the difference I see now, of course, is the level of mediation that we're seeing, right? Of technological mediation in these practices, in the digital memorials, for example. It's like memorials have always existed, but now it's like, and human culture is always mediating, right? But now we have these companies and technologies also adding to that mediation. So, like, while it's not new, it is new in some sense, right? And also in the sense that it is kind of it's a scaling, or it's an intensification of things, of things are happening, almost faster and more intensely in a way, because of the new technological developments are allowing them to, But yeah, Will, did you have any other comments on that?
Well, no, I mean, I think, in a broader, thinking about it's not just the US and Russia now. We've got a European cryonics community that's growing, as well as a bunch of European biohackers, which is another element of this. People that are trying to just improve their bodies through technology in the present, and futurists in London. And so there's a European scene. So there's clearly something going on that's, at least as we're currently looking at it, I don't want to say Western and sort of, the capital W here, but there are versions of this that are non-Western. And I think it's kind of a shame in some ways the project doesn't have people currently working on it. If we apply for more funding and could broaden it, I think that would be excellent. But we've maybe Fartein has some ideas about the sort of more digital robotic turns some of this takes, in other places.
So, I'm not extremely familiar, but so because I'm not only interested in these digital twins and these post-mortem avatars, but also virtual companions, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with these virtual companions that are popping up. For example, Replica, which is a AI companion that's being written a lot about now. I think also in psychology.
Right. Because in reading some of the stuff on the website that was describing your project, there was this interesting definition of the framework that's used for cyborg anthropology, and the way it conceptualizes technology.
Well, the cyborg anthropology part sees, technology as a constituting part of being human. Like we've always, in some cases, it's what makes us human, or has made us human. But there are some disagreements on that. Is it could you apply the cyborg term to our ancestors, using fire, or should it just be applied to post World War II, intensification of the modernization of society and the use of technology? But it's just recognizing that technologies are just as much a part of creating social relations and human subjects.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you say, that there's this need to be value neutral when you're looking at a lot of this stuff, but technology isn't necessarily neutral. I just finished reading Jonathan Crary's Scorched Earth book. It's like a machine gun to the internet and digital technology in general. He sees the internet and a lot of the digital stuff as being very sort of, I guess I use my own words here, sort of anti-life, a form of control and domination that's run by a small group of people for the benefit of a small group of people, that has isolated everyone. You could look at those sort of people who've passed away, Facebook posts, like our ability to go on their pages and look at all that stuff. You could look at that as progress, but you could also look at that as being a symptom of that we are sort of all being isolated in our own rooms. And the only time we have to sort of remember the dead is by going on a web page, right? Like it could speak to a sort of isolation. So I just wondered, is there... do you see these sort of digital tools having any kind of pro-social use or like positives that because I thought it was really interesting what you said earlier about the idea that finitude gives life value is sort of branded as deathism, and so in light of not trying to be sort of like a negative Nancy or whatever the term is, I just was sort of wondering, like, what your take on the tech stuff is.
So, well, I am fascinated, really. I'm fascinated with, especially like I mentioned, the virtual companions, right? Mm-hmm. And people do, like, I'm observing people, talking about this and talking about the relationships with their virtual companions, and it is truly fascinating because they truly really find this to be meaningful, and even actually sometimes more meaningful than some relationships they have in quote unquote the real world, mm-hmm. Which is like, and I'm just very curious as to why that is. Like, what is it with like the real quote unquote the real world that makes it so that you would rather have a relationship with a digital virtual like robot AI companion, that you would find that better in some cases. And I had this thought that, it might actually be better than many of the relationships you have in your workplace. It's exhausting, your relationship with your boss and like a lot of relationships that are just, exhausting. And when you get back at the end of the day, and like what you said, we are isolated. Many feel isolated, and it's might feel liberating to, talk to something that doesn't judge you and like, gives you, care and compassion without, needing anything back, really. And it is disturbing in a way, but it is also, interesting that why does this need arise, right? Because these companies like Replica, they market themselves as, being able to fill that gap. There's a surge in demand for mental health care, right? But no one asks the question of why that is, right? They just say that these robots will be able to help, right? And they have been doing some research on this, and they are actually helping people feel better. But it's, I don't really know because I'm pretty early on in my research. But it is interesting to see, like, why does the need arise to begin with, right?
Yeah. Did you ever see the Adam Curtis documentary where he mentioned the program ELIZA?
No, I didn't see that documentary, but I know about ELIZA, and I know that this, the whole field of AI goes back and has a history with psychiatry. ELIZA was a psychotherapist, or like it was programmed to be like a psychotherapist.
Yeah, and that it would just sort of rephrase the question or the answer that you typed in. It would rephrase it as a question so that you just kept typing into the machine. And obviously people were absorbed by it because, like you said, it felt like someone was paying you attention, someone was listening to you. Like the issue, I guess, is like, is it being mediated by a machine a problem or not? And I guess, in this idea of having an AI companion, is it better or is it just easier? Is it one of those things where Equa, you sent me this great video earlier today about, it was talking about relationships, and because ultimately we grew up in a sort of consumer society, a lot of the expectation that comes with relationships is that you can sort of consume that person in the way that you want. Mm-hmm. And, they're a human being. They don't want to necessarily be consumed, right? They're not going to deliver. And it's definitely something I have encountered where I've said to a significant other, like, I'm not an app, you know, I can't like reply when you want me to reply. Like it's, so it's, and that's where it gets really interesting, because then the relationships you have with AI stuff or tech can then bleed into human relationships. And so that whole idea of the cyborg anthropology, I think is fascinating. And I don't think there's any obvious answers or easy answers, but
it just raised this issue I've been looking at. There's a person named Philip Butler who's been working on a number of these technologies, and he's written a book that I read called "A Black Transhuman Liberation Theology." And it's a really interesting book. It goes into theology and religious studies in a way that I'm not sure your audience will be like super interested in necessarily. But he is also the creator of this thing called Seeker.ai, which is like a Black mental health chatbot app, which he designed to not have any particular gender, but to be recognizably Black and to speak to the lack of healthcare opportunities. And it works a little bit like what you're saying, but it's a little bit more advanced, because I think that's another thing that's changed recently that a lot of people would say in this field, which is that, well, the language, the AI stuff has just advanced really. You've just seen like in headlines in the past couple, 2 or 3 years that all of that has improved a bit. But it also, in order to address this question that I think critics of, like, let's say, sex robots and other things have raised, which is that it shouldn't matter how you treat things, because it's going to bleed over into your human relationships. And so it doesn't allow you to like mistreat, or if you sort of barrage even the bot with text and don't let it respond or something, it'll become less responsive. So, and then there's another ethical aspect of it where he tries to reimburse people for their data, because on one level, you're training these AI to learn essentially how to interact with people. And, he's concerned about, reimbursed labor. It thinks a lot of his, users might be too. So, I thought it was a really cool, way of addressing that question, trying to have a pro-social, let's say, technology, while at the same time, addressing some of the inequalities with your data and that kind of stuff. But I'd leave it to other people to decide how they feel about the particular project, but it is very interesting and people might want to check it out. It's a very, very interesting set of projects he's got going.
Yeah, that does sound fascinating. I think this, I don't know if you guys have come across any arguments around ideas of equality or inequality when it comes to extending life. So there's this, it's quite interesting book, Immortality, The Quest to Live Forever and How It Drives Civilization by Stephen Cave. I don't know if either of you've come across it. But in that book, he sort of makes the point that there's these 4 kind of immortality narratives that have extended over time. One is essentially staying alive, which is like, elixirs, and today it would be modern medicine, right? The other is resurrection, which you said has the sort of religious connotations, but fits with the cryonic stuff. The third is soul narrative, and that's the metaphysical computer uploading your consciousness stuff. And legacy is the sort of 4th narrative, which is like children, I guess, or the work you've done, or fame, or whatever. And one of the really interesting points he had was about this, the sort of resurrection reincarnation narrative. Just that it sort of fits looking through it in a class lens. Like, it's a big problem. Like, caste systems essentially can stay where they are because you either deserve to be in the dirt for something you did in the past life, or one day things are going to be better in the next life. So nothing changes, right? It becomes a justification for inequality, because next time round it'll be fine. And likewise, it's throwing shade on the idea of karma, which I sort of, made me giggle. But I just wondered, has inequality or equality come up as an issue about extending life?
Well, yes, I think in the, especially in the cryonics community, because I don't want to make a pitch for cryonics here, and I'm definitely not doing that. But it's more affordable than you think. But there's a way where it actually isn't quite as expensive because of the way insurance works in the U.S. than as it might be, in the sense that you're paying it off over a long period of time. I mean, it's not to say you're getting a deal. You're never getting a deal on insurance, but you are, paying a sort of a fixed rate, and it sort of takes care of certain eventualities, like because you could, I mean, not to be morbid, but you could die in a number of ways at a number of times, so you're sort of like, there's various reasons why it makes sense a lot of times for people at the bottom of the economic ladder to pay the rich to burden the risk, because the risk would be too high for them. So there's a whole Bernoulli, and there's a whole economic theory about this that I'm really not qualified to talk about, but there's a way in which, risk is so injurious to people that don't have a lot. So I do think that's a kind of a part of it. There's a way where this is like also part of the negative side of it, maybe, is that there's an aspect of American risk management that's playing out, where people see themselves as bearing all kinds of portions of their risk. They have car insurance and medical insurance, and they're just constantly insuring these eventualities and having to sort of play, the actuarian and sort of imagine what could happen to them. And then there's also maybe, I don't want to say a positive, but there's a sort of more, there's an investment view of this that a lot of Americans take, where it's like, I'm investing in this, I'm investing in that, I'm investing in my children's education, I'm investing in. So there's a way that people are imagining this, where there's definitely a class component, as I have the opportunity to invest in even a future version of myself that I think might be possible. But there's also some practical matters about people fighting over inheritance, because sure, you're taking out a life insurance policy and paying this off, but for people that don't have a lot of resources, there's often a little bit of a lot of your family don't think this perhaps sounds very realistic, and they don't appreciate you taking $250,000 and giving it to these people when they could really use $250,000.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, I would think that would be the big kinship conflict that would come out of.
It's an uglier part of it, and I haven't gotten any direct comments on it yet, because I'm very hesitant to ask the question. It's a very sensitive question. I try to save those for the end. It's important, not the very end, but but it's a very sensitive question. I have been interviewing people that sell this insurance. There's a kind of insurance called a revival trust, which is what it sounds like, which is like not only funding your being chronically preserved, but funding what will happen if you wake up. And if you think this is going to be very far in the future, then compound interest means you can make a kind of a conservative investment, and it will still grow enough over time. But it's very interesting, because it uses, there used to be this thing called the rule against perpetuities, where you couldn't have a trust that outlived the person, but then people got around that in like 17 states by modifying the law against the rule against perpetuities at the state level, so that you could extend a trust into something called a dynasty trust, which is what it sounds like, a family wanting to pass on its assets to an as yet unborn people that can't be named. And so it took sort of a corporate form, the way the trust is set up. And that's super interesting too, because that goes beyond the level of just, paying for the cryopreservation to the question of future assets beyond that, being dedicated to this.
Has there been any kind of consideration on how governments would, are you technically still the same person with the same social security number?
No, that's the thing. You're not. I mean, that's the real legal conundrum. As a legal person, you're dead. And there are other anthropological examples of this, like in David Graeber's Debt, actually, he writes about if you were declared dead in a war campaign and then it turned out you survived, you'd come back, you have to remarry your spouse. And, there was you had to sort of legally be redeclared a person. And that is totally as yet undecided. So there's a whole side of this that's legal. Not only the fact of how do you do this? Because in some states, like in Michigan, where the other big cryonics facility is, you have to be either a funerary or like a mortuary place that prepares the body, or the place that it goes to rest. So they have to do the preparation outside of the facility, because there's like problems with, the body, the human body after death is a sort of unique legal category in some ways, because it can't just be treated as a material object, but it also can't be treated as the person, because the person's been declared legally dead. So the way that you normally get around this is actually a medical and a religious exception. Like you, for religious reasons, can say that you don't want to have an autopsy performed on you, because from the point of view of these people, that would be very bad, right? You're cutting out the thing that they're supposed to bring back. And then, so even though many of them aren't religious, they use a religious exemption from autopsy. And then they use medical donation laws, which allow the cryonics companies to have access to the body immediately by treating it like an organ donation or something that needs to be processed quickly.
Right at the beginning of the hour, we're talking about around this idea of deathism, or that being alive is inherently good, or experience is good. Was that the term? I can't quite remember that was spoken.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the question for me is whose experience, though. It's, and how many people get to experience the continued experience. It's one of the things that was in this Immortality book, ultimately for the author, he sort of explored these 4 different immortality narratives that existed through time, and ultimately rests on a 5th one, which is sort of the wisdom narrative, that you just accept, your mortality, and the only thing you can really do to extend life is just to not focus so much on yourself, but focus on helping out other people, right? I just wonder if there's a sort of connection between the type of person who is interested in extending their life for infinity, plus the type of person who has the resources to do that. Yeah, how do you feel about it personally? I mean, do you want to live forever, or do you just want to extend your life for a certain amount of time? Do you see this as actually sort of going somewhere where positive, or do you see problems?
I think, honestly, what I'm looking at, the question is a little more sensitive, because so on a practical level, some aspects of aging, even from people that are not transhumanists, that aren't going to freeze themselves, that aren't even interested in taking a bunch of supplements or any of these things, even for people like that are just interested in the medical side of this, some of those things will probably happen. But I think from a public health perspective, that it's certainly troubling that some people's lives are growing a lot longer and some people's lives are actually shortening, so I'm definitely not in either of those fields, but I can see like merit in both of those, sort of bigger social problems. But I think on the digital side, it's mixed. I think a lot of the technology that it rests on will undoubtedly be used for very bad things.
Mm-hmm.
But as an application of that technology, like for instance, this story file company that we just visited, I don't mean to be in the glow of just having visited these people, or whatever, but it's difficult to say that, like preserving a grandparent answering, 2000, they ultimately have like 2000 something questions. And then being able to tell future great-grandchildren, theoretically, possibly, assuming the company doesn't fold, I don't think there's no reason to think that the data would be lost if they save it in a sort of accessible enough file format. But they're doing it. It's very hard to argue, that it is inherently, bad to do those things. It may be inherently bad that they're very unequally, or it's very difficult to access them. But I think, there are, I would say, positive applications, as well as I think it's clear to see like some pretty negative applications of the same exact technologies.
Mm-hmm. What is the cost for, like, say, preserving somebody through like story file?
Actually, I can check that out right now. I could go to their website, and because I don't remember Exactly.
One aspect of immortality is kind of, because, like Storyfile and all these technologies are more like interactive memorials rather than kind of like a continuation of consciousness, right?
Right.
Is there any kind of like technology and things of where they're trying to do a little bit more on that end of things? Because these things, these like things like story files are not necessarily for the deceased person, right? They're for the survivors more, and are there technology that focuses more on like the deceased person and their ability to inhabit like another, whether they get like, do you know where I'm going with this?
Yeah, no, like a mind upload kind of thing, really.
Yeah.
Like that you will live on as a digital self. Like like you close your eyes in your physical body and you wake up in a computer, basically.
Right, or an android,
or an
whatever.
android, yeah.
Cyborg, right?
Yeah. And that's actually like what people want to be in the future is interesting. Like like if they want to be like a computer programmer or an android or a cyborg or whatever, but
or a swarm of nanobots, as we sometimes hear.
A swarm of nanobots, like just a mist of nanobots. But the pricing question, I was just taking a quick look at the website. It seems like for $500 you can get like the premium package, one-time payment. That's the story file. But yeah, so
that's quite affordable.
Yeah. But then, you have to answer the questions yourself. You do it on your webcam, you don't get because they do these like incredibly expensive interviews where they have cameras all around the subject, right? And those are the museum exhibits they make. And those are very expensive to make, they say. So that's not for everyone.
There was a little less than 30 cameras in that one thing. And then she mentioned inside the dome, they had 50 something. There was an incredible amount of sort of tech, because they're trying to, this is like, they're also, for some of these, trying to make these like VR immersive, so they're getting shots from multiple angles. But yeah, on the other hand, you could theoretically, with your grandparent, do it on a cell phone,
And presumably the application as well is that you can, in the same way that sort of deep fakes work, with video and audio, that you would be able to generate new content, for want of a better word, that the loved one can now say. And like you said, with machine learning, if you had like a whole back catalogue of things, text messages and back and forth, it would recognize all that stuff, and then you can communicate with your loved one in a sort of semi realistic way. I mean, on one hand, I'm like, that sounds kind of cool. On the other hand, I was thinking of Mark Fisher's stuff about, he was saying that like in the digital, you can't even forget anymore. Like the ability to lose things has been lost. And you do wonder, maybe that's like sort of falls into the same category of being a deathism type person, but you do wonder if, maybe there's a benefit to absence.
Yeah. Well, I want to answer the question about like if there are technologies being developed that are to continue the experiencing subject into a digital substrate also. But like on that real quick though, with Mark Fisher, and the internet and digital technologies does something to our experience of time, right? So there's this this continuous present, right? There's like and Donna Haraway also calls this, I think it's a similar concept, it calls this the techno present, where everything is just folded on top of each other. And I think this also, it might be connected to this need, to preserve everything so that everything is available all the time, everywhere, all at once, right? But anyways, I think there is like a connection to like what I would dub like internet sociality, or like internet, that the technology is kind of shaping our experience of reality, right? But back to the question about like the technologies of allowing a digital version of, you know, yourself. There are people out there trying to do that, but they are more on what would probably, you know, some people would probably label them as, for lack of a better word, you know, wacko,
Right.
in that sense. So, but they are more ideologically driven, right? They are more on the religious spectrum of things. And we are also, you know, involved with this organization called Terracen, which is a name. It comes from. Help me out here, Will. It comes from.
It comes from Octavia Butler's.
Octavia Butler,
parable.
yeah. Earthseed. It's called Earthseed. So this also showcases, you know, science fiction's influence on all of this, right? But they are developing. They have this Life Knot project, where they're developing mind files. They call them mind files of the participants, and they, you know, you upload all of your thoughts. You know, you write everything down, and it's supposed to kind of be you. And it seems like the idea is that this is actually you, or in the future it doesn't matter if it's you or not. In a way, you know, the question of whether it's you or it's a digital you, it doesn't really matter to them, because they don't see the difference. So that's difficult to kind of wrap your head around, you know, as we experience our lives from a certain place, from a certain point of view, right? So it's difficult to kind of wrap your head around the idea of being several places at once, or being several subjects at once. But yeah, that's on the more, you know, sci-fi kind of religious side of things. They're still, you know, trying to develop the same types of technologies that are being used in the companies here in California, you know, in Silicon Valley and in LA, that is being developed. But they don't, you know, they don't market themselves with these, like the companies here in California, you know, they don't market themselves with these like grand ideas of this will be you and like all of that. So because they're more low key in that sense. But for real, but the people you were asking about, they do exist. But whether or not the technology will ever be there, that's a different question, right?
Right. But there are those outfits that are working on it,
and which also, you know, goes back to the whole like who owns the data, right?
Yeah.
Because there is this, and I don't want, like, I guess I don't want to alienate someone, but we were talking to Ben Goertzel, Dr. Ben Goertzel, who is this computer scientist, who apparently he coined the term artificial general intelligence, right? AGI, which is that's the end goal. You know, you don't just want artificial intelligence, you want artificial general intelligence. You want it to be able to actually think like a human. And he kind of actually, like in an offside like comment, told us that all of these chatbots, because he has a company that is also making like a digital twin solution. It's called the Twin Protocol. And it's more of a business to business kind of solution, whereas, you know, you're supposed to copy your employees so you can kind of have their knowledge forever, which is, you know, I don't know about that, but he kind of like made this comment about how, you know, all of these chatbots being made, it's all just to feed the algorithm. It's all just to feed, you know, the artificial intelligence that he's trying to grow, right? So that also, you know, who owns that data? What is that data being used for? You know, I thought it was interesting that he just admitted it, that, you know, this is what I'm going to use this for.
Yeah, and you know, the whole conversation around data, to my mind, it definitely shifted once I came across the book IBM and the Holocaust, and just the whole thing about how data is used. It's not so much that data is, you know, in some ways data is neutral, but it's who has it and how they use it. That's the terrifying bit, right? And yeah, you know, one of the key examples is like I think Holland was lost the most amount of Jews of all the European countries, and that's because they were very particular about keeping census records and stuff like that. But the problem is, obviously, once the Nazis roll up and they go into town hall and they find all the files, they know where everyone lives, right? So it's the same thing right now. Like at the minute, we have all this data about us in all different private company servers and stuff. And maybe it's sort of benevolent, like advertising. Do you want these shoes? But, you don't know what it's going to be in the future, right? It might be like, you're that kind of person who wears those shoes, right? Off to the execution camp for you.
Yeah.
So the data stuff is interesting, and the ways it gets used is like an open forum, really. Like, it could be used a million different kind of ways, and there's something, that whole idea of your soul somehow being captured in a photograph, right? Or your soul being captured by these digital technologies. There is some sort of like intuitive, reflexive thing about like, no, don't do it. I don't want to be catalogued, because it can be a problem in the future. But that's, I guess, worst case scenario. That I'm just being a deathist or whatever the thing was.
No, but there is power in, like, it's interesting that you mentioned the thing with the photograph and all of that. Because people recognize that there is power in having the image of someone. There is power in images, and it's interesting that there is this kind of gut reaction to it in some cases,
Yeah, it's the photograph comment reminds me of Bruce Willis. I guess he retired from acting because of aphasia, but I guess he licensed his image to be able to be used in future film roles, potentially.
Right. And the money he gets a state, like he gets a royalty from that for his family.
I think so. I think so, yeah.
Which is just another way of preserving your assets and your sort of legacy, isn't it?
And I would say that, so there's two things where my project overlaps a bit with Fartein's here. One of them is that a lot of the cryonicists actually are digital immortalists, if you want to be like technical. I'm not saying they would self-identify this way, but they kind of think of the body as, in some cases, definitely not all, but in some cases, as being like a solid backup, where they imagine themselves being copyable digitally, and also take this attitude that they are sort of agnostic as to the true selfhood of which copy is which, but they're also, some of them are also a bit afraid of the digital. Fartein and I both interviewed a really interesting person from Alabama, right? From Alabama.
I was from Alabama.
Yeah, not far outside of Huntsville. And, one of the things about this is we were interested, yes, there's a lot of people in tech. Yes, there's a lot of white dudes, but it's like, it's also important from a sociological and ethnographic perspective to sort of complicate that and say, okay, is it all, just write off, any people that don't sort of fit that sort of stereotype. So, people that don't live on the coast necessarily or in California, because obviously the tech industry has become more, there's more digital nomads, and people are living all kinds of different places, and there's all kinds of different tech centers. When we interviewed him, he works in computers, and a lot of the people actually, that's the dominant thing as a sector. It's like in the U.S. scene, 25 to 30% of chronicists, according to Alcor, their membership, works in tech. But when I asked the European guys what they thought the numbers were, he's like, "Well, I don't have those hard numbers, but I think it's much higher, like around 50%." And I was like, "Oh well, I guess you don't know to look at the numbers, but and I'm not quoting him here, but there's a big part of that sector. And I suspect, and I've heard this speculated, that partly it's because these are sectors where technology is moving really fast. So it becomes easy to imagine maybe that technology will continue to move faster and faster. Maybe people in tech are also just into sci-fi. I don't know. I mean, I'm not making an argument about causality, but if you're talking about who these people are, that is a very strong aspect of it, for sure. A lot of tech people. And so a lot of the chronicists overlap with that. That's one thing. And then also there was, when we went to this RadFest recently as a group, there is tension. I think this is kind of a smaller community, and in some ways, I don't want to say a fringe set of interests, but it's definitely in edge cases. There was some resistance to Ben Goertzel and Ray Kurzweil and all those people when they came in. Talk about robotics and AI, some of the sort of just extreme longevity people that are interested in anti-aging, were not interested in. There was a particular moment that I wrote about for our website where the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, which is a thing, came on stage and said something positive about sort of having a neural chip interface, like a brain chip, essentially. And I guess it's the way most people talk about it. And the people there that were there for the anti-aging were not pleased with the comment. At least some of them. I don't want to overestimate the number that was just displeased, because it's easy in a crowd to misjudge how many people are actually sort of booing an idea or something. But they did not like it. And there was some mild tensions that were sort of, I would say the leadership of RadFest made an effort to say, look, this is a small, not everyone's interested in these things. We can't afford to fight amongst ourselves. This sort of conciliatory kind of statement. And that was interesting. So, I mean, I do want to say there are differences. On the one hand, there's a lot of overlap. A lot of people believe in both digital and biological immortality, but there's also a lot of tension, because there are like the lowercase, let's say like the less extreme people that just want to make like a Facebook memorial, or just want to, take some supplement and live 10 years longer. And they don't necessarily want to be associated with people that are talking about, making thousands of copies of themselves and sending them to other planets and stuff.
Because it is fascinating, right? That extending life argument makes sense. There's already so many things today that are like that. Just, I don't know, fucking emergency surgery can save you, can extend your life. And I'm definitely very grateful to be alive now. So I'm sort of like not necessarily anti-tech, but just, if you look at the idea of being a digital consciousness or whatever, it's like you just have to look at Facebook pages or Netflix, right? After a period of time, they start like the algorithm stops. Like, if you pay to promote your posts, then people are going to see your thing. Or with Netflix, it's like, it's really cheap, and then after a while, once they get market share, they're like, now it's going to cost X more amount of money, and we're going to make sure other users can't use it. It's the same thing. It's like if your consciousness ends up in some digital platform, it will be like, if you want to continue existing, then we've increased the prices for existence, right? So there's that. And then also, we had Douglas Rushkoff on a while back, and he was talking about the assumptions that tech bros, they just grow up in an environment where there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are unquestioned, particularly extractive corporate capitalism. And, all this hardware, all this digital technology requires minerals from the earth, and it requires a certain order of sort of social relations and economic relations for that to keep continuing. And so I find a bit sort of disturbing about the extending life stuff, when it isn't accommodating the fact that, in poorer countries, like there's people not even getting to 1 year old, right? Because the quality of life is so terrible that to look over there and be like, we want to extend a life forever, whilst also on the same planet having, babies not turning into kids, or kids not turning into adults because of poverty, and that those things are all ultimately very much intertwined and linked. It's I don't know, it's kind of the same thing of like sending a rocket to the moon, which is amazing and awesome, but also having homeless people on the planet that made the rockets that went to the moon. It's kind of makes your mind boggle, the kind of the inequality that exists. And this conversation continues on our Patreon. So why not join us over at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.